Hello, my name is Joy Bennett, and I'm the curator and archivist of the Hancock Historical Museum in Findlay, Ohio. A lot of people have been asking questions about the Spanish flu, and I decided to do some research so that I could answer them, and I will be able to share that information with you today. So, the Spanish flu was also known as the 1918 flu pandemic. It was an unusually deadly strain of influenza that turned into a global pandemic. Lasting from January of 1918 to December of 1920, it infected 500 million people, about a quarter of the world's population at the time. The death toll is estimated to have been anywhere from 17 million to 50 million, and possibly as high as 100 million, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Why was it called the Spanish influenza? The pandemic likely acquired this nickname because of World War I, which was in full swing at the time. The major countries involved in the war were keen to avoid encouraging their enemies, so reports of the extent of the flu were suppressed in Germany, Austria, France, the United Kingdom, and the US. Spain was neutral in World War I and therefore the only country not imposing wartime censorship. Since Spain was under no restrictions, it was the only country really reporting on the influenza virus that was spreading, which encouraged people to call it the Spanish influenza. Interestingly enough, one of the first documented cases of the first wave of the 1918 influenza epidemic was in March of 1918 at Camp Funston in Kansas. U.S. Army cook Albert Gitchell developed flu-like symptoms and a fever. The sickness spread through the camp of 54,000 troops, leaving 38 dead and 1,100 having been hospitalized. The troops were then moved out and shipped out and therefore started spreading the sickness to others. So how did it spread? When an infected person sneezes or coughs, more than 500,000 virus particles can spread to those nearby. The close quarters and massive troop movements of World War I hastened the pandemic and probably both increased the transmission and augmented mutation. The war may also have increased the lethality of the virus. Some speculate the soldiers' immune systems were weakened by malnourishment, as well as the stresses of combat and chemical attacks, increasing their susceptibility. A large factor in the worldwide occurrence of this flu was increased travel. Modern transportation systems made it easier for soldiers, sailors, and civilian travelers to spread the disease. Governments also refused to create quarantine restrictions, citing that factory workers and others were essential to wartime production. Coupled with the lack of reports in newspapers, this left the population ill-prepared to handle the outbreaks. Few statistics. 500 million people contracted the influenza. 675,000 deaths in the United States. Half of the soldiers sent to Europe that died of influenza, not from combat. And the outbreak really came in 3 waves and lasted for 2 years. So, was this a super virus? The 1918 flu spread rapidly, killing 25 million people in just the first 6 months. This led some to fear the end of mankind and has long fueled the supposition that this strain of influenza was particularly lethal. However, more recent studies suggest that the virus itself, though more lethal than other strains, was not fundamentally different from those that caused epidemics in other years. Much of the high death rate can be attributed to crowding in military camps and urban environments, as well as poor nutrition and sanitation, which suffered during wartime. It is now thought that many of the deaths were due to the development of bacterial pneumonias in the lungs that were weakened by the influenza. It was the second wave from October through December of 1918 that the highest death rates were observed. A third wave in the spring of 1919 was more lethal than the first wave, but much less than the second. Scientists now believe that the marked increase in deaths in the second wave was caused by conditions that favored the spread of a deadlier strain. People with mild cases stayed at home, but those with severe cases were often crowded together in hospitals and camps, increasing transmission of a more lethal form of the virus. So why was the second wave so deadly? While in Europe, the disease mutated. Some speculation has arisen it was due to the mustard gas and other gases being used in the trenches. And the disease started attacking healthy people from ages 20 to 40. The disease triggered an immune overreaction in healthy people, which led to the body being overloaded with a healing hormone called cytokine, which caused inflammation and a fatal lung buildup, causing the infected to have difficulty breathing and develop pneumonia, which was generally the case of death. People who were less healthy had less of a buildup of cytokine and therefore were more apt to recover, which is why it was so deadly to the younger population. So how deadly was it? In fact, the vast majority of people who contracted the 1918 flu survived. National death rates among the infected generally did not exceed 20%. However, death rates varied among different groups. In the U.S., deaths were particularly high among Native American populations, perhaps due to lower rates of exposure to past strains of influenza. In some cases, entire Native communities were wiped out. Of course, even a 20% death rate vastly exceeds a typical flu, which kills less than 1% of those infected. At this time, there was not only a shortage of physicians, many of whom had been drafted and sent overseas. This resulted in the physicians who were too old to be drafted, and medical students left to treat those infected with influenza on the home front. The Red Cross created a national committee on influenza and asked businesses to grant volunteers days off if they agreed to work night shifts at Red Cross hospitals, especially the emergency hospitals that were later created. In addition to there being a shortage of doctors, there was a shortage of nurses in the United States at this time. Partly due to the war and partly due to the Red Cross refusing to use African American nurses until the worst had passed. With all awful occurrences, benefits tend to spring up. One benefit that came from the experience of the pandemic was helping to give greater weight to belief in science and the development of germ theory. Doctors in the war also discovered the importance of antiseptic surgery, and all of these things together brought a greater understanding of the human body, medicine, and how to treat it. So many measures were taken. Gauze masks were passed out to people who were instructed to wear them whenever they were out in public, if they had to be out in public. Stores were prohibited from holding sales, which would bring large groups of people. Funerals were restricted to 15 minutes, and railroads restricted passengers, requiring that they have a written note from a physician stating that they were not infected with influenza before they were allowed to board. Steep fines were leveled at people ignoring quarantining and other ordinances. And there was a shortage of coffins, morticians, and gravediggers. Though since this was during a war, there's usually a shortage of men in many professions. So it's hard to say with that one. All right, what about Hancock County? Hancock County was affected the same as every other place was, essentially. At least that was as rural as we are. The newspapers did not really put much in the paper about the Spanish influenza until about October of 1918. And that's when you've got articles like these popping up, that Arlington schools are closed. Rules to protect your children from the flu. Why parents must keep their children at home. the flu causing deaths. And then there were smaller articles stating like so-and-so was home with the Spanish flu, or so-and-so was recovering from their bout with the Spanish influenza. So there wasn't a huge outbreak here, but there were some instances. One interesting thing was that we ended up with a celebrity doctor, Dr. Albert Linneweaver, who was a physician and an artist, was called to do some work in Washington, D.C., helping those who were the victims of Spanish influenza. He must have been moved around. I haven't really been able to find out a lot of what he did, but he was later given a commendation from the New Hampshire Health Commission for his good works. Now you see, social distancing is not a new concept. It was used in the epidemic of 1918, and you can see how well St. Louis was able to flatten that curve, especially when you compare it with Philadelphia. So, way to go, St. Louis. Way to be ahead of things. People 100 years ago made it through the Spanish flu, and we will get through the coronavirus. Practice your social distancing, stay at home, stay healthy, wash your hands, and stay positive. We will make it. Thank you.